Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us in our weekly word study as we're going through Judges chapter 3. And last week, actually 2 weeks ago, excuse me, we didn't have class last week. 2 weeks ago, left you with a cliffhanger, if you will look at that way, on chapter 3, verse 22, where this scenario was set up where Ehud um, asks for an audience with the king, and this is the king of Ammon, Moab, that's persecuting and ruling over the Israelites. And what's interesting is that he was given a exclusive, unsupervised unchaperoned audience with the king. Should have never happened. And again, this was just an incredible turn of events. And as we left off in verse 22, he pulls out a dagger from his what was strapped to his leg, and he stabs the king. And again, verse 22 is just very graphic in describing how this occurred and the circumstances about it. It must have been something that he must have bragged about later on, because otherwise, nowhere else do I find in the Bible where someone's demise is portrayed this graphically. Well, maybe except with if you look up a story of Sisera, who was a um, head of one of the armies of Assyria, and there was a lady that caused his demise. We may get to that in the book of Judges, so I won't spoil it, but there's another similar event that will give you chills like this one will. And so this is described, and Ehud went out from the porch in verse 23. Somehow he shut the doors, he locked them from the inside, and he went out and escaped. And of course the servants couldn't get in, and they said, oh, he's going to the bathroom, basically, which is covered by a biblical euphemism called covering his feet. May have those of you that listened to my study in First Samuel found that King Saul went through a very similar euphemism experience here, and as David was in the cave where Saul went in to relieve himself. So again, kind of an interesting biblical euphemism for going to the bathroom. So they figured he was doing his duty, and so they waited and waited, and it didn't go in. And it looks like a lot of time waited between verse 24 and verse 25 that they were ashamed. They didn't know what was going on. So somehow they found a key, opened it, and they found that he was dead. Want to look back at verse 19 and just highlight something. This term quarries that were by Gilgal. I want you to remember that because that's going to show up in a later part of the rest of the study. So just to give us a idea of where we're at here and bring us to an understanding of the location, we see a map, and of course this shows all the judges of Israel, and we've looked at this in weeks prior, circling with my pointer here around Ehud, and you'll see the location of Gilgal, which is where he just was. So remember that location as we then go to the next verse. And so verse 26 says that Ehud escaped while they tarried. And then look again, he says he passed beyond the quarries and escaped to Sirath. And it came to pass when he was come, he blew a trumpet in Ephraim, and the children of Israel came down. What jumped out to me that I need to look at a little bit was, there were two verses that talked about the quarries. What's the big deal with a quarry? And why would, obviously, it was a land marker, it was something to base where he was. We don't have any clue anymore. It doesn't mean really anything to us. So I did a little bit of research that I thought was kind of interesting about, is there anything historically, archaeologically, about the quarries at Gilgal? So when I Google it, of course, up comes Wikipedia, and it says it's an ancient underground quarry in the Jordan Valley. But what's interesting is this quarry wasn't discovered until 2009. by some archaeologists from the University of Haifa. And so this was really kind of interesting. I put in a couple snippets here, and you can maybe look it up on your own if you want to take it a little bit deeper. But it talks about this quarry, and this was actually a very sacred site and a very renowned site to the Israelites. Um, and it has been used for obviously centuries, millennial, um, as a quarry, and where these stones were taken from. And it relates to these 12 stones that were dug from this quarry, has to do with it making a marker for the children of Israel. It was placed in Gilgal. And so this has some real significance for the Israelites. And so that's why he mentioned it. It'd be similar to us maybe going to New York and saying, okay, here's the Empire State Building, and I'm a couple blocks from there, or I just passed the Empire State Building and I'm going here or there. This was a real interesting spot. And so, just to give you a little bit of idea of what the terrain looked like, it is very arid. Not a lot of grazing. Shows some wild sheep, I believe, just grazing on a little bit of grass that's there. But otherwise, this is just rock and stone. Here is a picture inside the quarry, underground, where they cut the rock out of it. Um, I don't know what makes the designation of why a quarry, why you dig one place and cut rock out and looks like the whole area is just filled with rocks. But this must have been a site where the stone had some integrity to it, where you could cut it apart and it would remain in its cut shape and be solid and not break apart. And also you could be underneath there and not be in the risk of collapse of the um, cave and quarry that you're digging in. So, it was just kind of a unique thing here. And just found it interesting that the Bible verse mentions the quarry. I could go and search on it and find a historical reference, an archaeological reference that showed that, yes, these quarries are there, that they had significance, and that, they existed from this time in the Bible, and they were confirmed and found just as recently as 2009. And so we have the advantage of being able to find things um, that are biblically based but confirmed with archaeology. And I think that's just a wonderful thing. I like doing that anytime that I can. And so, verse 27, it said he went and blew this trumpet in the mountain of Ephraim. Well, looking at the map again, it's a little bit of a distance here from Gilgal, where my pointer's at, until this purple area. Even the closest part here, he would have to travel quite a bit, blow this trumpet, and somehow convince everyone that, hey, it's okay to follow me, as verse 28, and convince them that the Lord has delivered the enemy of the Moabites, because he only killed the king. All the armies are still there. All the other leaders, whoever took over after him, is still there. So it's not like you wiped out half the army and now, bring the Israelites to go and clean up the remainder. He had to really be able to convince them that God had delivered them. And maybe he rehearsed some of the things that happened, that, hey, I got an audience with the king. I made it through the metal detectors. No one saw my dagger. I was able to convince them all of his security, his Secret Service agents, to leave the room and let me alone with the king. And then I was able to slay the king, and described all the things that happened. And so surely all of this is a confirmation that God, was delivering me and delivering us from, these Moabites. And take courage, come and go with me. And so they went down, and it says they took the fords of Jordan towards Moab. It looks like they must have created a safety route of maybe preventing the armies of the Moabites of going over. And so it says in verse 29 that they slew of Moab at that time. And here the King James English gets really fun. 10,000 men, all lusty, all men of valor, and there escaped not a man. Well, how can you not be intrigued and interested in finding out what this word means that they were all lusty? Of course, we are 400 years, almost 500 years removed from the King James Version of when it was written in 1611. And so these words take on a different meaning, but we get to look into the Hebrew. That's the fun part. So we're going to take a look at that. And verse 29, and this is a Bible program called Bible Hub, and it says, and they killed at that time the men of Moab, about 10,000 men, and it doesn't use the word lusty. It uses the word stout and men of valor, and none of them escaped. Okay, well, stout and lusty obviously don't go together in my mind of what I first thought the meaning would be. And so let's take a little bit closer look. Interesting word. It's called shaman. It looks like shaman, but please don't get any correlation to shamanism or any of those Oriental words of meaning. This is not that at all. Just happens to sound the same, I guess. And so it gives the indication that these were fat and robust people. So if we look on the right side of here, this shows us that this word shaman, everywhere it's used in the Hebrew Bible. And so it's used in Genesis chapter 49, verse 20, that they should be rich. King James has it, they should be fat. You get to Numbers, it pretty much uses fat all about. You get to Judges, where we're reading from, um, and it says lusty or robust. So you kind of get the impression that these were men, but what we don't know is were they muscular? What does fat and robust can mean two different things in our terminology. They could be very muscular and built, and other words that we use, that they're ripped, they got muscles bulging out everywhere, they've, worked out and built themselves up. I would have to think that if these guys were in military battle, that they wouldn't be so fat that they're not able to be very uh, worthy of fighting. I tend to think this is making reference to that they were just very, very strong, that they were very robust. They had muscles bulging everywhere, that they look like, Arnold Schwarzenegger in his prime when he was um, coming from the uh, his bodybuilding time. And so that's what made this a greater victory, that they were men of valor. They were all just as muscular, and the Israelites should have never been able to conquer them because these guys were just men upon men, strong men, but yet they killed 10,000 of them and not one escaped. And so that's how I interpret this after looking at the Hebrew. From that, we get to verse 30, that Moab was subdued on that day, and the land had rest fourscore years. A score is 20, so this would be 80 years that they had rest. And then verse 31, as we complete this chapter, um, it is really something to see how this is put in there, because we go from verse 30, we read verse 31, and then we jump into chapter 4. And this poor guy named Shamgar, listen to what he did. It says, after him was Shamgar, the son of Anath, which slew of the Philistines 600 men with an ox goad, and he delivered Israel. So he gets one line of press here, where the other guys seem to get a lot more. So after 80 years of rest, the Israelites, we assume, did bad things. The Philistines came in to oppress them because God was judging them or giving them um, a punishment from the neighboring nations. And here was a guy named Shamgar, and he killed 600 men. What is an ox goad? And did a little bit of looking here. This was one picture. There were numerous pictures, but this one looked the most formidable. It looked like out of the other pictures that I saw, I'd rather have this tool. So whether he used this tool or whether he used one of the more simplified ones that was just a long stick with a pointed end, I think this one's got more ability to do more damage. So I took this picture, but this is an ancient tool that they found representation of, and it was used to guide livestock, kind of to poke them and prod them along when they got a little a little tired or that they weren't moving along as fast as possible. And obviously it can do some damage. But this guy had this goad in his hand and he slew 600 Philistine men. So the question we have to ask is, were they all at one time? Was this just 600 men surrounding him and he had some supernatural strength and he had just a great or had a great talent for hand-to-hand combat? We grew up, or at least I grew up with um, these shows like the Kung Fu and all of these other guys, Bruce Lee, who had such great ability and take out, or even like Karate Kid, Mr. Miyagi takes out all these people because he's so talented. This was in that sort of category. Obviously, we want to believe that this was a supernatural event, that God's power came over him, as we'll see later on with maybe Samson, where he kills hundreds of people with the jawbone of a donkey. And but here he slew 600 men, and we have to think that this probably happened all at one time. What an incredible event that must have been. But yet he only gets one verse. Poor guy, he gets one verse in the Bible, but he delivered Israel. He was used by God. And again, I wish we knew more about him. The Jewish commentators really don't have much else to say. They're pretty much wondering the same thing, why he only gets one word of press. I guess his name probably doesn't show up anywhere else, but we could do a word study on his name and see if there's any hidden meanings in the letters of his name. And I'll do that and maybe have that information for next week. So, well, I hope you enjoyed this study today as we finished Judges chapter 3. Come back next week. We'll pick up on chapter 4. We'll see if I can find anything more on this interesting gentleman named Shamgar who killed 100 Philistine soldiers with a pointy little ox goad. So God bless you. Take care, and we'll see you next week. Bye bye.